The auctioneer's gavel came down on a broken saddle, and with it, the life of Wilhelmina Atwood was sold to the highest bidder. Except the highest bidder was a man named Roy Cutter, and the second highest was a dusty, square-jawed cowboy named Bernard Norris who had exactly $11.40 to his name, a lame horse tied to a post outside, and absolutely no plan whatsoever. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a bead of sweat on a sun-baked forehead. The cattle drives had made Caldwell rich and rough in equal measure, and the saloons outnumbered the churches by a count of 7-2. Dust was the permanent condition of everything: the streets, the storefronts, the faces of the men who came and went with the herds. It was not a town that took particular notice of injustice. Injustice, in Caldwell in 1878, was as common as flies on a carcass and about as welcome to swat away. Bernard Norris had ridden into Caldwell 3 days prior with a cattle outfit from Abilene, and he had been left behind when his horse, a brown gelding named Caesar, had thrown a shoe and gone lame on the south road. The outfit's foreman, a man named Hollis Drummond, had told Bernard he could catch up or he could stay, but the herd was not waiting. Bernard had stayed, spent 2 of his days nursing Caesar back to something workable, and was now spending his 3rd day trying to find passage or work or both. He had been walking past the auction house, a weathered building on Main Street that sold everything from grain to furniture to livestock, and sometimes, in the darkest tradition of the frontier's less examined corners, human beings as well, when he heard the shouting from inside. Bernard was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with hands that were rough enough to strike a match on, and a face that had been burned brown by 10 years of open-sky work. He was not a man of many words. He was not a man of grand ambitions. He had 40 acres somewhere in his dreams that he had never quite caught up to, and a mother back in Missouri who wrote him letters he read by firelight and answered badly. He was, in every measurable sense, an ordinary man, but he stopped when he heard a woman's voice cut through the general noise of the auction house like a knife through linen. "I am not livestock," the voice said. It was low and even and furious. "I am a person, and you will not do this." Bernard stepped through the door. The room was crowded with cattlemen, drifters, and merchants. At the front of the room, behind a scarred oak table, stood the auctioneer, a wiry man named Gus Pendleton with a gap in his front teeth, and a gavel that he was slapping against his palm with theatrical impatience. On a raised platform that usually held grain sacks or furniture, stood a young woman. She was perhaps 23, maybe 24. She had dark auburn hair that had been pinned up at the back of her neck but was pulling loose in strands around her temples. She was wearing a plain dress, brown calico, the kind that working women wore, but it was clean and pressed, and she held herself inside it with a dignity that seemed almost defiant given the circumstances. Her eyes were a particular shade of green-gray, the color of sage after rain, and they were burning with a controlled fury that Bernard could feel from across the room. Beside her stood a man Bernard did not yet know one Floyd Atwood, a thin, consumptive-looking man in his mid-50s with the yellowed skin of someone who had been drinking too long and the restless hands of someone who owed money to too many people. He was her uncle, as Bernard would learn. He was also the man who had put her up for auction. The story, as it came out in bits and pieces over the subsequent days, was this. Wilhelmina Atwood's parents had died of a fever outbreak in the winter of 1876, leaving her in the guardianship of her father's brother, Floyd Atwood, a man of spectacularly poor character and spectacular debts. Wilhelmina had managed the Atwood property, a small farmstead east of Caldwell, for 2 years, doing the planting, the selling, the record-keeping, and most of the physical labor while Floyd drank and gambled and borrowed money from men who were not gentle about collecting it. The debt had finally caught up. Floyd owed Roy Cutter, the town's wealthiest and least savory cattle broker, $300, an amount Floyd could not conceive of repaying. Roy Cutter had a solution. He wanted Wilhelmina for his household. Whether that meant housekeeper or wife or something less defined and more troubling, he had not specified. Floyd had agreed, and Gus Pendleton had agreed to run it through the auction house to give it a veneer of legality that it did not deserve. This was what Bernard Norris walked into. The bidding, such as it was, had already begun. Roy Cutter stood against the left wall with his arms crossed and the satisfied look of a man who expected to get what he wanted, which he generally did. He was 45, thick-necked, wearing a good coat and a silver watch chain. He had bid $60 because $60 for what he wanted was, in his estimation, a bargain. There was no other bidder. There was not supposed to be another bidder. This was, as far as Roy Cutter was concerned, theater. $60 going once, Gus Pendleton said, slapping his gavel on his palm. 65, said Bernard Norris. The room turned. Roy Cutter uncrossed his arms. Wilhelmina Atwood turned her burning, sage-colored eyes on the stranger in the doorway and seemed to be calculating something. Bernard did not have $65. He had $11.40. He had no idea why he had said 65. He only knew that the fury in that woman's eyes was the most honest thing he had seen in a very long time, and the whole situation had the smell of something he could not stand to walk away from. Roy Cutter looked at Bernard with the careful assessment of a man who was deciding whether an obstacle needed to be removed or simply laughed at. He settled on laughing. 70, Cutter said. 75, Bernard said. Wilhelmina was watching him now with something that was no longer just fury. It was fury and something else, something careful and searching, the look of a person who has learned not to trust rescues because rescues have a price. 80, Cutter said, and his tone had dropped a degree or two in temperature. 85, Bernard said. Floyd Atwood was wringing his hands at the edge of the platform. Gus Pendleton was looking between the two bidders with the professional excitement of a man who liked higher numbers regardless of what they were for. Cutter stared at Bernard for a long moment. Then he smiled, and the smile was not warm. $100, he said. Final. The room went quiet in that way rooms go quiet when everyone knows something is decided. Bernard had $11.40. He also had, tied to a post outside, a lame horse that was now walking again and something else, a saddle. His saddle. It was old. The left stirrup leather was cracked almost through, and the seat had been mended twice with different leather, and one of the conchos had gone missing sometime last year. It was, by any objective measurement, a broken saddle. But it was his, and it had belonged to his father, and it was the last thing his father had left him. And Bernard Norris looked at that ceiling for one long breath and thought about all of that. Then he thought about the woman on the platform who had said, quietly and with great precision, I am not livestock. $100 cash, Bernard said, and the saddle off my horse outside, worth at least another 50. You do the arithmetic, Mr. Pendleton. Gus Pendleton blinked. Roy Cutter's smile had gone away. He was reassessing the obstacle now, deciding again between removal and dismissal. Bernard kept his voice level. I have the cash. I have the saddle. Somebody ought to go check it's there before Mr. Cutter makes up his mind to outbid fresh air, which is all he'll be bidding against. There was a beat, and then someone near the door said, I'll go look, and stepped out and came back in half a minute and said, saddle's there. Looks old, but the tooling's fine. Gus Pendleton, who was at his core a businessman, cleared his throat. $100 and a saddle of assessed value. Mr. Cutter, do you wish to bid? Roy Cutter looked at Bernard Norris for a long moment. Bernard looked back. He did not look away, and he did not look particularly afraid. And Roy Cutter was a man who read people the way other men read weather. And what he read in Bernard Norris was the particular quiet of someone who had already made his decision and was not going to unmake it. That kind of quiet was, in Cutter's experience, troublesome. Keep the girl, Cutter said, and walked out. Gus Pendleton brought down the gavel. Sold. Bernard Norris stood in the dusty auction house with $11.40 in his pocket, and the knowledge that he had just bid $100 he did not have, and he looked at the woman on the platform, who was stepping down with great dignity, and he thought, well, now what? Floyd Atwood shuffled over to Bernard with his hand out, and Bernard looked at the hand and then at Floyd's face and made no move to shake it. "You owe this man $100, Gus Pendleton said, appearing at Bernard's elbow with a ledger and a pen. "I have $11.40, Bernard said pleasantly, "and the saddle, which I am giving you as well. You work out how to get the rest from Mr. Cutter, since it was his idea to make this a proper transaction, or from Mr. Atwood there, since it was his idea to hold one." Gus Pendleton opened his mouth, looked at the room, looked at Floyd Atwood's complete lack of resources, and seemed to calculate the realistic possibility of extracting money from this particular cowboy. He closed his ledger. Wilhelmina Atwood picked up a small carpet bag from the corner of the platform where someone had placed it, her belongings apparently, which Floyd had packed for her in advance, another detail about the situation that made Bernard's jaw tighten, and she walked across the room to where Bernard stood, and she looked at him very directly with those sage-green eyes. "I do not know you," she said. "No, ma'am," Bernard agreed. "And I am not obligated to you by this transaction, whatever that man wrote in his ledger." "No, ma'am, you're not." "What is your name?" "Bernard Norris, out of Missouri originally, working cattle most recently." She studied him. There was a quality to her attention that Bernard found simultaneously comfortable and unnerving. She was not performing anything. She was simply looking, with clear and direct intelligence, at the situation in front of her. "Where are you riding?" she asked. "South of here. There's an outfit near Medicine Lodge I can join on. It's 3 days' ride, maybe 4 with my horse's condition." Wilhelmina glanced toward the door through which Roy Cutter had departed. She glanced at Floyd Atwood, who had the decency to look at the floor. She looked at the room full of men who had stood and watched and not said a word, and then she looked back at Bernard. "I have nowhere to go that is not worse than this," she said. "I'm a practical woman. May I ride with you as far as I can be useful and no farther?" "You can ride as far as you want to ride," Bernard said. They walked out of the auction house together into the bright Kansas sun of early May, and they were strangers who had just altered each other's lives in ways neither of them had yet begun to measure. Caesar was tied at the post. He was a good brown gelding, 14 years old and wise about it, and he looked at the addition of a carpet bag, and a woman with the philosophical acceptance of a horse who had seen most things. Bernard retrieved the reins and they walked to the livery to see about a second horse, which Bernard negotiated for on the strength of his promise to pay when he reached the outfit at Medicine Lodge, a promise the liveryman accepted only after a long look at Bernard's honest face, which was, Bernard had found, his most reliable currency. The horse they got for Wilhelmina was a gray mare named, according to the liveryman, Dolly. She was not young, but she was steady, and Wilhelmina mounted her with an efficiency that suggested she had spent a good deal of time on horseback. They rode south out of Caldwell in the late afternoon of that day, the town shrinking behind them into the flat Kansas horizon, the sky ahead going amber and rose where the sun was beginning to decline, and they did not speak for a long time. It was Wilhelmina who broke the silence, perhaps an hour out of town. "The saddle was your father's," she said. Bernard looked at her. "How do you know that?" "The way you touched it when you came outside, before we left. You put your hand on it like you were saying something to it." Bernard looked at the trail ahead. "It was. Is he gone? 3 years now." Wilhelmina was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry. Mine have been gone 2 years, both of them." "Fever? I heard in the room. I'm sorry too." She nodded. The nod was brisk and contained, the nod of a person who has had to be economical with grief, because there was always more work to do. They rode until dark and made camp on the bank of a shallow creek, in a stand of cottonwood trees that offered shade they did not yet need but would in the morning. Bernard built a fire with practiced efficiency. Wilhelmina produced from her carpet bag a small bundle of dried beef and a tin of hardtack crackers that she offered without ceremony, and they ate by firelight without the formality of table manners, which suited both of them. Bernard Norris, who was not a man of many words, found himself thinking a great many of them. He sat across the fire from this woman he did not know, and he turned her over in his mind as carefully as he would turn a stone to look at what was underneath. She had been sold, and she knew she had been sold, and she was dealing with that fact in the way she seemed to deal with most things, with a contained practicality that did not pretend the facts were other than they were. She had assessed him in the auction house and determined that 3 days in his company on an open trail was the least bad option available to her, which was not, Bernard thought, the most flattering beginning to a human acquaintance, but he found he respected her for the honesty of it. "You did not have $100, Wilhelmina said. It was not quite a question. I had 11.40 cents. She looked at him over the fire. That was a reckless thing. Yes, Bernard agreed. Why did you do it? He thought about how to answer that honestly. He thought about the voice that had cut through the room, "I am not livestock," and he thought about the particular fury in eyes the color of sage after rain, and he thought about how some things, when you see them happening, simply cannot be walked away from, not if you want to remain yourself afterward. "Because you were right," he said. "You are not livestock." Wilhelmina looked at the fire for a long moment. When she looked back at him, something in her face had shifted, not softened exactly, but become more three-dimensional, the way a landscape looks different when the light changes. "You lost your father's saddle," she said. "I did. I will see that you get it back, or its value in something else. You don't owe me anything, Miss Atwood." "I know I don't," she said, with a firmness that made it clear she was not speaking from obligation but from principle. "I repay what I owe. It is a matter of how I conduct myself. Will you accept it on those terms?" Bernard looked at her across the fire and felt something he was not entirely prepared to name, a warmth that was not the fire and a steadiness that was not the earth. "On those terms," he said, "yes." She nodded with the same brisk efficiency as before and pulled her blanket around her shoulders, and they each settled into the quiet, and the cottonwood leaves rustled in the night wind, and Caesar and Dolly breathed softly at the edge of the firelight. Bernard lay on his back looking at the stars, and thought about the 40 acres in his dreams, and thought about a woman who said, "I am not livestock," and thought about how reckless things sometimes had a logic to them that you could not see until you were well into them. He slept better than he had in weeks. The next morning arrived with a clarity that only the open plains can produce, the sky a pure unblemished blue, the grass silvered with dew, the air carrying the smell of creek water and distance. Wilhelmina was already up when Bernard woke. She had the fire rebuilt and a small pot of coffee balanced over it, the coffee made from grounds she had in her carpet bag, and she was standing at the creek's edge watching the water. Bernard sat up, looked at the coffee, looked at the woman standing at the water, and felt the particular disorientation of waking up in a situation that was already different from anything you had planned. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said without turning around. "The coffee is almost ready. Your horse has been grazing well. He seems to be walking evenly now." "He's better. He was mostly tired more than hurt." She turned then and came back to the fire, pouring 2 tin cups of coffee with a steady hand, and gave him one, and sat on a flat rock with hers, and they drank together in the morning quiet. They talked over coffee. It started with practical things, the route, the condition of the trail, the weather, and then drifted, the way conversations do when there is time and space for them, toward other territory. Wilhelmina talked about the farm east of Caldwell, not with sentimentality, but with the specificity of someone who had worked a piece of land and knew it well. She talked about the wheat crop she had planted the previous autumn, which was still in the ground and would not be harvested by her, and she said this with a flatness that was its own kind of grief. She talked about her mother, who had been a schoolteacher from Ohio, and her father, who had come west from Pennsylvania with ambitions about cattle that had turned into something more modest and more honest: a wheat farm and a good vegetable garden, and a small herd of 12 cows that Wilhelmina had sold after her parents died because she could not manage them alone. "Why did you stay with your uncle?" Bernard asked. "If things were so poor." "Where would I go?" she said simply. "I am 23 years old and unmarried, and I have no family elsewhere. A woman in my position in 1878 does not have many places to go. I know that is not what is right. It is simply what is true." Bernard heard the quiet bitterness in that and did not argue with it, because she was correct, and arguing with correct things was its own kind of dishonesty. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I think about that," she said, "and I have not arrived at a complete answer. I am good with numbers. I was doing the farm accounts by the time I was 14. I can cook and I can sew and I can ride and I can do hard physical work without complaint. Those are things someone somewhere needs." "I will find where that is." Bernard nodded. He believed her. She had the quality of a person who did not say things she did not mean. They broke camp and rode south, and the day was good, warm but not brutal, with a breeze off the west that kept the air moving. The Kansas plains stretched around them in every direction, a sea of grass that rolled gently under the wind, dotted with occasional groves of trees along creek beds, and farther east, the dark moving shadows of cattle herds on the trail. In the afternoon they passed a small settlement, a general store, a smithy, 3 or 4 houses, and a church, and Bernard stopped for supplies, a few pounds of dried beans and salt pork, and while he negotiated with the store's owner, Wilhelmina browsed the shelves with the careful attention of someone who is looking at everything and touching nothing unnecessarily. She stopped at a small section of tools and picked up a leather awl, turned it in her fingers, set it back. Bernard noticed. When he had finished with the storekeeper, he came to where she stood. "Did you need that?" "No, I was only looking." "Do you do leather work?" She looked at him sideways. "My father taught me. He had a kit. I used to repair the harnesses and the saddle rigging. I am fairly good at it." Bernard thought about this for exactly 1.5 seconds, and then he bought the awl and a length of good leather lace and a small block of wax, and he paid for it with some of his remaining money and put the package in her hands. Wilhelmina looked at him. "I said I did not need it." "It's not about need. You were looking at it the way you look at something that belongs to you. That is a different thing." She held the package in both hands, and her expression did something complicated that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "You observe things," she said. "I have a lot of practice at not talking," he said. "It leaves room for other things." She put the package in her bag and they went back to the horses, and the settlement fell behind them as they rode south again into the afternoon. That evening, camped again under an open sky, Wilhelmina took out the leather tools and the leather lace, and she sat at the edge of the fire, and she studied Bernard's remaining gear, his saddlebags, the reins on Caesar, his worn boot stitching with a professional eye. "The right saddlebag strap is about to go," she said. "May I, please?" Bernard said, and watched while she worked. She was good at it. Her hands were confident and sure, and she used the awl and lace with the precise economy of someone who had done the work 1,000 times. She worked quietly, concentrated, and the firelight caught the copper in her hair and the careful line of her profile. And Bernard Norris looked at the Kansas sky above and thought, with some alarm, that he was in considerable trouble. He had been in love once before, or thought he had been, at 21, with a girl in Abilene who had laughed at his jokes and then married a banker. That had been a thing of surfaces, he thought now. What was happening in him at this fire, on this trail, beside this particular woman, was something with more depth to it. It had begun the moment he heard her voice cut through that room, and it was growing in the strange soil of honest conversation and morning coffee and the sound of a leather all working steadily in firelight. He did not say anything about it. He was not sure he had the words, and he was sure she did not need the complication, not now. She had enough to manage without a cowboy adding his feelings to the pile. He said instead, "That is very good work." "Thank you," she said, not looking up, And then, after a pause, "Tell me about the 40 acres." He blinked. "What 40 acres?" She did look up then. "When you are quiet and looking at the horizon, your face does something that says you are thinking about a specific place, not a vague somewhere, a specific somewhere. I thought perhaps 40 acres. Bernard stared at her and then laughed, a real laugh, full and surprised, that rose into the night air. "You are extraordinary," he said. She looked back at her work. "Tell me about the 40 acres." He told her. He had not told anyone in a long time. The dream of it had lived quietly in him like an ember, something he kept covered because the wind out here could kill a thing like that if you exposed it. But he told her. 40 acres in southern Kansas, or maybe northern Indian Territory, near water. He wanted cattle, not a big herd, not the kind that took 40 hands to move, but a good working herd, 50 or 60 head, the kind you could know individually. He wanted to stay in one place long enough for the earth to know his footsteps. He was tired of following other men's cattle across other men's land. Wilhelmina listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment, running the lace through the last hole. "That is not a small dream," she said. "No. It is a good one, though." "You think so?" "I think the best things are usually specific," she said. "Vague dreams stay vague. Specific ones have the possibility of becoming real." Bernard looked at her in the firelight and thought about how this woman had, in less than 2 days, become the most interesting person he had encountered in the last several years, and how that was a fact that did not seem inclined to become less true with additional time. The second night on the trail passed quietly. The third day brought rain, a soft, steady Kansas rain that swept in from the northwest and reduced visibility and turned the trail to thick red mud. They rode wrapped in their coats, heads down, and spoke less because the rain made talking an effort. Caesar picked his way through the mud with patient care. Dolly was equally sensible. The miles came slowly. At midday they found shelter, a farmer's barn, empty of people but populated with a dozen horses and a milk cow and the good warm smell of dry hay. The farmer, it turned out, was not far away. He was a man named Jasper Cole, 50-something, with a broad face and kind eyes, and he came out to the barn to check his animals and found 2 wet strangers there, and instead of running them off he said, "Come eat," with the directness of a man who has spent enough time alone on the plains that company of any kind is welcome. Jasper Cole's wife had died 4 years prior, and he cooked for himself with a kind of resigned competence. He put together a meal of beans and cornbread and salt pork, and they ate at his kitchen table while the rain ticked against the windows, and he asked where they were headed and they told him, and he asked if they were married, and there was a small pause. "No," Wilhelmina said, without apparent discomfort. Jasper Cole looked at both of them with the shrewd assessment of a man who had lived long enough to read situations. He said nothing more about it. After dinner, while Jasper and Bernard talked about the cattle business and the condition of the trails, Wilhelmina washed the dishes without being asked, and then she found a crack in the window frame that was letting in cold air and she mentioned it. And when Jasper said he had been meaning to get to it, she asked if he had some oakum or cloth, and she fixed it herself, quickly and neatly. Jasper Cole watched her do this with an expression of bemused respect. "Where are you really heading?" he asked her when Bernard had stepped outside to check the horses. Wilhelmina dried her hands on a cloth. "I am not entirely certain yet," she said, with her characteristic honesty. "A woman who can do what you can do," Jasper said, "shouldn't have any trouble finding a place in this country, unless someone has made it difficult." "Someone made it difficult," she said. "I am in the process of making it easy again." Jasper nodded. He looked toward the door through which Bernard had gone. "That man out there," he said carefully. "He looking out for you, or is he a complication?" Wilhelmina thought about the auction house. She thought about $11.40 and a broken saddle that meant something. And she thought about a laugh that had risen into the night air, full and surprised, and a face that did something specific when looking at the horizon. "I am still determining that," she said, "but I think he may be looking out for me." Jasper Cole smiled. Good, he said. That is a good thing. They stayed the night in Jasper Cole's barn, and in the morning the rain had passed and the sky was clean and pale blue, and the mud was already beginning to dry in the early sun. Wilhelmina left Jasper Cole with a small note. She had found his paper and pen on his writing desk and asked if she could use them, which she left on his kitchen table. Bernard, who had not seen her write it, asked about it when they were mounted and moving again. I wrote down some information about treating the kind of cough his milk cow had, she said. She's been coughing since yesterday. There is a particular remedy with pine pitch and warm water that my father used. I told him how to make it. Bernard looked at her for a long time. Is there anything you don't know how to do? I cannot play the piano, she said. That seems like a very small gap. The corner of her mouth moved. Not a full smile, but close. They rode into the third day with the energy of a better morning, and the conversation between them had found a rhythm by now long comfortable silences broken by exchanges that went deeper than small talk, that had the quality of two people genuinely curious about the contents of each other's mind. Bernard asked her about the school she had attended as a child, and she told him about a one-room schoolhouse in eastern Kansas, run by a woman named Miss Pryor who had opinions about mathematics and Latin, and no patience for the idea that these subjects were not for girls. Wilhelmina had loved mathematics particularly, she said. The way things could be broken down into their components and reasoned through to a precise answer. The way it did not require anything except logic and honesty. People are not like that, Bernard said. No, Wilhelmina agreed. People are considerably more complicated than mathematics. That is both their best quality and their most frustrating one. Which am I? She looked at him with those sage-green eyes. I haven't finished the equation yet, she said. He laughed again, and she noticed, as she had noticed the night before, how the laugh changed his whole face, the lines of concentration easing, the jaw unclenching, something genuine and warm surfacing in the dark eyes. She thought he probably didn't laugh enough, and then she thought that was the kind of observation that led to wanting to change things, and wanting to change things led to attachment, and she had not decided yet whether attachment to this particular man was wise. She was a practical woman. She thought about things practically. What did she know about Bernard Norris? She knew he had thrown $11.40 and his father's saddle into the path of something unjust, which spoke to character. She knew he had not asked anything of her in return, which spoke to respect. She knew he listened when she talked with a quality of attention that was rare in people and rarer still in men she had encountered, which spoke to intelligence. She knew he had a specific dream about 40 acres and a small herd that he had kept to himself until she asked, which spoke to something she thought might be depth. That was a considerable amount of knowing for 3 days on a trail. They reached the outskirts of Medicine Lodge on the afternoon of the 4th day. It was a larger town than the settlement they had passed through, a proper street of businesses, a hotel, 2 churches, a sheriff's office with a fresh coat of paint. The cattle outfit Bernard was looking for was camped east of town, and they rode to it together. The outfit's ramrod was a man named Pedro Salinas, a stout, energetic Mexican man in his 40s who was excellent at his work, and ran the operation with a kind of organized authority that kept 40 men from stepping on each other. He came out to meet them, looked at Bernard, looked at the woman beside him, and raised an eyebrow at the comprehensive absence of a second saddle. Bernard explained the situation in broad terms. Pedro Salinas listened, looking between Bernard and Wilhelmina, and said nothing until the explanation was done. "Can you cook?" he asked Wilhelmina directly. "Yes," she said. "Can you ride hard if you need to?" "Yes." "Do you complain when things are difficult?" She looked at him without expression. "I am here," she said. "Make your own assessment." Pedro Salinas made a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a laugh. He looked at Bernard. "We are short a camp cook since Hector left us at the last water. She can ride with the outfit as far as Wichita if she takes the cook's work. Pay is fair." He named a wage. Wilhelmina did not blink. "I will take it," she said. That was how Wilhelmina Atwood came to ride with the Salinas outfit from Medicine Lodge to Wichita, a journey of 7 or 8 days, depending on the herd and the weather. Bernard was one of 35 riders, and his job put him out with the herd from before dawn to after dark, working the flanks, keeping the cattle moving, handling the particular crises that a cattle drive produces with tiresome regularity strays, river crossings, the occasional animal that decided to make everyone's life difficult. The evenings were camp. The camp had a fire and a chuck wagon, and Wilhelmina, who had immediately assessed the provisions in the chuck wagon and reorganized them with a brisk efficiency that the assistant cook, a young man named Tommy Briggs, found both impressive and slightly terrifying. Bernard came into camp in the evenings with the other riders, dirty and stiff from the day, and he ate the food that Wilhelmina produced, food that was, by unanimous agreement of 35 cowboys, significantly better than anything Hector had made. And he did not have the opportunity in those evenings to talk with her the way they had talked on the trail, because there were 34 other men with the same general proximity, and they all needed feeding, and he was only one of them. But she saw him. He noticed that, across the fire, in the general noise of tired men eating, she would look at him with that direct, measuring attention, and sometimes he would look back, and there was a particular quality to those moments, a clarity, like the air after rain, that he was beginning to find necessary in a way that surprised him. On the third evening out of Medicine Lodge, a situation arose that had nothing to do with cattle. 2 of the riders, a pair of brothers named Seth and Dale Pickett, both of whom had been drinking from a flask they were not supposed to have on the drive, had developed the drunk man's conviction that the camp cook was there for their entertainment. They said things to Wilhelmina at supper that they should not have said, first one and then the other, with the escalating boldness of men who are encouraging each other. Wilhelmina said nothing. She served the food and kept her face neutral and her back very straight, and most of the camp was watching now, the quiet kind of watching that precedes intervention or the failure of it. Bernard put down his plate and stood up. He did not raise his voice. He walked to where Seth Pickett was sitting, and he stood over him and said, quietly enough that only the nearby men could hear, "You'll want to walk that back." Seth Pickett looked up at him with the unfocused belligerence of a man with whiskey in him. "Mind your own business, Norris." "This is my business," Bernard said. "You are going to walk it back, and then you are going to go to your bedrolls, and in the morning you are going to apologize to Miss Atwood, and if that seems like too much to you, then we can discuss it further out away from the camp." There was a long moment. Dale Pickett was looking at his brother. Seth Pickett was looking at Bernard. Pedro Salinas appeared from the far side of the fire. He looked at the Pickett brothers and he said, "You heard the man." And that settled it, because Pedro Salinas's word on this outfit was law. Seth Pickett muttered something that was close enough to an apology and stood up and went to his bedroll, and Dale followed. The camp exhaled. Bernard went back to his plate. Wilhelmina came and refilled his coffee cup without being asked. She did not say anything. She did not need to. But her hand, as she poured, was very steady, and she stood close enough that he could have said something quietly. And when she straightened to go, she paused for just a beat, long enough for him to see her face, and what was in her face was not gratitude exactly. It was something more complicated and more honest than that. It was the look of a woman who is reassessing an equation. She went back to the chuck wagon and he drank his coffee and looked at the fire. Later that night, when most of the camp was asleep and the men on watch had taken up their positions out with the herd, and the fire had burned down to a low, steady glow, Bernard was still awake, sitting apart from the sleeping camp on a flat piece of ground, thinking. He was thinking about deserving. The word had come to him somewhere on the trail between Caldwell and Medicine Lodge, and it had not left. He had acted on instinct in the auction house, instinct, and a kind of hot conviction that was not thought out in advance. He had not considered the consequences with any particular thoroughness, and the consequences had deposited him here, in a camp outside Medicine Lodge, riding beside a woman who was, in his estimation, one of the finest people he had encountered in his 28 years. And the question that had been riding alongside him, as persistent as Caesar's hoofbeats, was whether he was a man who deserved to be in her orbit. Not as a rescuer, she had made clear she was not interested in being anyone's project, but as a companion, a person worth knowing, a man worth trusting. He had 10 years of cattle driving behind him. He had a good horse and some skill with rope and leather, and he could read the weather and he knew the land. He had a dream about 40 acres that he had not acted on because acting on it required money and steadiness, and a life that had more architecture than following a herd north every spring. He thought about what she had said about specific dreams. That specific ones had the possibility of becoming real. He thought about the kind of man who builds something real, and whether that man was inside him somewhere, waiting. He thought about this until the sky began to lighten in the east, and then he went to saddle Caesar for the day's work. They reached the Arkansas River crossing on the 5th day, and it was high, not dangerously so, but high enough that it needed careful management. The crossing took most of a morning, with riders on all sides of the herd keeping the cattle moving, and 2 horses nearly went down in the current, and nobody was injured, but the morning had the hard, focused energy of work that requires everyone's full attention. Afterward, in the noon stop on the north bank, the camp was loud with the particular relief of difficulty handled. The riders were eating and talking, and the mood was good. Tommy Briggs made a joke that was not particularly clever but landed anyway, and the camp laughed, and in the laughter Wilhelmina looked at Bernard across the fire and smiled. It was not a contained, almost smile. It was a real one, open and warm, and he thought, a little surprised at itself, as though it had arrived without permission. It lasted only a moment before she turned back to what she was doing, but Bernard held on to it. He carried that smile for the rest of the day. In the evenings, the opportunities for conversation were limited, but they found them. 5 minutes at the edge of the camp, 10 minutes while she was cleaning the cooking gear, and he was nearby with nothing urgent. They talked about small things and large things with equal comfort. She told him about a book she had memorized sections of a collection of poetry her mother had brought from Ohio, and recited a passage from memory while drying a pot, without self-consciousness, the words coming out with a naturalness that suggested they were simply part of how she thought. He told her about a river crossing he had done 3 years ago where the water had been chest-high on the horses, and they had lost 2 steers and nearly lost a man, and about the particular cold fear of that, and how it had changed the way he read water ever since. She told him about learning to read the wheat, how you could tell from the color and bend of the stalks what the plant needed, whether it was water or nitrogen or simply time. He told her about learning to read cattle, the same kind of attention, he said, the same patience required. She said she supposed most living things communicated if you had the patience to listen. He said he thought that was true of people too, and they were both quiet for a moment after that. On the 6th evening, Pedro Salinas came to Bernard after supper with a proposition. He needed someone reliable to ride ahead to Wichita and make arrangements with the stockyard. The outfit had a buyer waiting, and there was paperwork and timing to manage. He was asking Bernard because Bernard was, in Pedro's estimation, the most reliable man he had riding for him at present, and because Bernard's horse was in the best condition of any in the outfit. Bernard said he would do it, and then he thought about Wilhelmina and the question of what she would do when the outfit reached Wichita. He went to find her. She was at the edge of the camp where the firelight thinned into dark, sitting on the step of the chuck wagon with her carpetbag open, the leather tools in her hands. She was working on something. He looked closer and saw that it was a piece of saddle leather, tooled in a pattern of intertwined leaves and vines. The work was intricate and careful and beautiful. "What is that?" he asked, sitting on the ground near her. "Something," she said without looking up. "For someone." "Yes." He watched her work for a while. The pattern emerged from under her hands with a patience that was itself a kind of artistry. She ran the edge of the awl along the leather with the absolute certainty of a woman who knows what she is making and where it is going. "I am riding ahead to Wichita in the morning," he said. "Salinas needs someone to manage the stockyard arrangement." She looked up. "Ah," she said, "I wanted to tell you before I went." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. "I wanted to ask," he said carefully, "what you plan to do when the outfit reaches Wichita." She set the leather work down on her knee. "I have been thinking about that," she said. "There is a woman in Wichita, a Mrs. Helena Strand, who runs a boarding house and also a laundry. She placed an advertisement in the Caldwell paper last autumn looking for help. I do not know if the position is still available, but I thought to inquire." Bernard nodded. It was a sensible plan. It was the kind of plan Wilhelmina Atwood made. "And after that?" he asked. "That depends on what I find," she said. There was a pause. The fire snapped. Somewhere in the dark a night bird called. "I would like to find you in Wichita," Bernard said, "if you would permit that." She looked at him, not with the measuring assessment of the first days, but with something that had more of the arithmetic finish, a look that knew its answer and was deciding whether to say it. "I would permit that," she said. He rode out in the morning before dawn, Caesar moving well in the cool air, the darkness ahead lightening gradually into the particular silver pink of a Kansas sunrise. He rode and he thought, and what he thought about was Wichita, and after Wichita and the 40 acres, and a woman with sage-green eyes who finished other people's equations and mended things with her hands and recited poetry over a pot. He arrived in Wichita the morning of the following day, a full day ahead of the herd. He found the stockyard agent and conducted the business Salinas needed conducted with a thoroughness that surprised the agent, who was accustomed to cattle drivers having a flexible relationship with paperwork. Then he did something else. He found the land office. He had been to land offices before, looked at maps, asked about prices, and left without doing anything, always because the moment required money he didn't have, and a commitment he wasn't sure he was ready to make. He went in now and asked his questions again, and the land agent, a young man named Cartwright with ink-stained fingers, showed him a map of the territory south and east of Wichita, land that was opening up, good land near water, at prices that were lower than he had expected. "That parcel there," Bernard said, pointing, "near the creek, who owns that? Federal land, available for homestead filing or purchase." Bernard did the mathematics in his head. His wages from the current drive plus what he would make finishing the season. It was not enough, but it was not impossibly far from enough either. He left the land office without filing anything but with the numbers in his head, and he walked down Wichita's Main Street in the afternoon sun thinking about specificity and possibility. And he went to the general store and bought a small notebook and a pencil, and he sat outside on a bench, and he did the mathematics more carefully, working through what he had and what he needed, and what the gap was. The gap was real but not insurmountable. If he worked the fall drive and hired on somewhere for the winter and was careful with money in the way he had not always been careful, he thought about a woman who kept her accounts with absolute precision and knew where every dollar was. He thought about a woman who was good with numbers and had managed a farm and planted wheat. He thought about what a specific dream looked like when two specific people worked toward it. He was getting ahead of himself. He knew that. He put the notebook in his pocket and went to find the boarding house. Mrs. Helena Strand turned out to be a small, decisive woman in her 50s who ran a clean operation and knew it. Bernard inquired, somewhat cautiously, whether she still needed assistance, and she said she did, and he described Wilhelmina Atwood with care, her practical skills, her intelligence, her character as he had observed it, and Mrs. Strand listened and then said, "Send her to me when she arrives," with the finality of someone who has heard enough. Bernard went to the hotel and got a room and sat on the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about deserving. He had been thinking about it for days, this question. Every mile between Caldwell and here he had been turning it over. He was not a man who thought well of himself in excess. He had never been the kind of man who was confident in his own worth without evidence. His father had taught him that worth was demonstrated, not assumed. That a man's character was what he did when he didn't have to do anything, when there was no one watching and no profit in it. He had gone into that auction house because he couldn't walk past it. He had bid $100 he didn't have and given away the last thing his father had left him, because the alternative was to walk away from something that was wrong, and he had never been able to do that, as long as he could remember. That was not heroism. That was simply how he was made, but being made a certain way was not the same as deserving the things that came from it. He wanted to deserve her not as a possession, nothing like that. She had made it clear she belonged to no one, and he believed that completely, but as a companion, as someone she chose to allow close. He thought about what that required. He thought about the 40 acres and the specific dream and the notebook with the numbers in his pocket. He thought about a man who built something instead of only following someone else's thing. He thought about whether he was ready. He thought he might be, and he thought the only way to find out was to try. The outfit arrived in Wichita 2 days later. Bernard was at the edge of town when they came in, riding out to meet them, and Pedro Salinas raised a hand in greeting, and behind the chuck wagon, on Dolly the gray mare, Wilhelmina Atwood was riding in the late afternoon light with her back straight and her hair coming loose at her temples. She saw him and she slowed Dolly, and he rode Caesar alongside her, and they rode into town together in the general dust and noise of 40 men and several hundred cattle, and she said, "You look like you have been thinking." "I have," he said, "about the 40 acres, among other things." She looked at him sidelong. "Tell me." He did not tell her all of it. Not yet. He told her about the land office and the map and the parcel near the creek, and she listened with the focused attention she gave to everything, and when he had finished she said, "What is the gap?" He told her the number. She was quiet for a moment, doing the mathematics. "That is achievable," she said, "in a year with careful management." "I thought so too. It would require someone who was organized about the finances." It would. They looked at each other, and between them, in the noise of the arriving cattle and the calling riders, was a silence that said several things neither of them said aloud. And then they were in town, and there were people and things happening, and the moment expanded into the general business of arrival. Bernard delivered Wilhelmina to Mrs. Helena Strand's boarding house, introduced them, and stood in the parlor while they talked, which they did with the brisk, mutual assessment of two capable women who are deciding immediately whether to like each other. The decision appeared to be mutual and positive. Mrs. Strand showed Wilhelmina the room available to her, small, clean, with a window that looked onto the back garden, and Wilhelmina said she would take it, and they agreed on terms. When they came back downstairs, Bernard was still in the parlor, hat in hand, and Mrs. Strand looked at him with the particular look of a woman who has assessed a situation and formed a view. "You can call on her Sundays," she said to Bernard, in the tone of a woman who is also saying, "and not any other time without proper cause." "Thank you, ma'am," Bernard said. He paid Wilhelmina her wages from the drive. He had collected them from Pedro Salinas along with his own and given them to her in a folded envelope. And she took the envelope and put it in her bag without counting it in front of him, which he liked. She trusted that it was right. He thought about what it meant, that she trusted that. They said goodbye at the door of Mrs. Strand's boarding house, with the awkwardness of two people who have been in close company for days, and are suddenly navigating the formalities of social distance. He held out his hand and she shook it, which was very businesslike and also, he thought, extremely funny, and she seemed to think so too because the almost smile appeared. "Sunday, then," she said. "Sunday," he agreed. He went back to the hotel and lay in the proper bed and thought about Sunday. The week between the arrival and Sunday was the longest week Bernard Norris had experienced in recent memory, which surprised him because he had spent plenty of weeks in conditions of actual hardship with nothing to look forward to. He filed the paperwork with the stockyard, settled his accounts with Pedro Salinas, and then spent the remaining days in the productive management of restlessness. He hired on with a small local ranch for day work, fence repair, and some branding work that needed doing before the season ended, and he worked hard and was paid and put every dollar in his pocket toward the number in his notebook. On Sunday he put on his cleanest shirt, which was not particularly clean, and his best coat, which was moderately respectable, and he went to the boarding house and knocked. Mrs. Strand admitted him to the parlor, and Wilhelmina was already there, in a different dress than he had seen her in before, a blue one, darker blue, which she had clearly acquired since arriving in Wichita, and which suited her very well, not that he was going to say so without some more suitable occasion. Her hair was pinned up more deliberately than it had been on the trail, and she was sitting very straight in the parlor chair, and she looked, he thought, like a woman who was fully inhabiting herself. They went for a walk. This was the appropriate Sunday activity, and also, Bernard thought, the most honest one. Neither of them were parlor people, and the ability to walk beside someone and have a real conversation was something they had already established that they were good at. Wichita in the fall of 1878 was a busy, growing town. The cattle trade had brought money and people, and the infrastructure of a genuine settlement, real streets, brick buildings going up alongside the wood ones, the sounds of hammering and commerce. They walked along the main street and then down toward the river, where the afternoon was quiet, and they talked. She told him about the week at Mrs. Strand's, the work which she had mastered quickly, and the other boarders, some interesting and some not, and Mrs. Strand herself, who was formidable but fair. He told her about the day work at the ranch, and about the numbers in his notebook, which had grown slightly since the last conversation about them. She listened and updated her arithmetic. "You could have the land in a year," she said, "possibly less if the winter work holds. I have been thinking about that." "Have you found winter work yet?" "Not yet. I was thinking of asking around." She said nothing for a moment. They had stopped at the river's edge and were watching the water, which moved with the slow patience of autumn. "Mrs. Strand," Wilhelmina said carefully, "has mentioned that she is considering expanding the boarding house. There is a building next door that is for sale. She would need someone to manage the accounts and the negotiations." "That seems like your work," Bernard said. "It is," she agreed. "But the building also needs carpentry repairs before it is habitable, someone with practical skills. She is looking for a carpenter or handyman and has not yet found one." Bernard considered this. He was not a carpenter by training, but he was competent with wood and tools in the general way that a man who has worked with his hands for 10 years tends to be. "I could speak to her," he said. Wilhelmina turned from the river and looked at him with those sage-green eyes. "I thought you might say that," she said. And there, in the afternoon light at the river's edge, was the real smile again, the open, warm one that arrived without permission, broader this time, less surprised at itself. He wanted very much to say what he was thinking. But they were standing at a river in Wichita, and they had known each other for 2 weeks, and he had promised himself he would let things be honest and properly paced, and not reckless in the way that only benefited himself. "Wilhelmina," he said. "Bernard," she said, and the fact that she used his name, the full name, which most people shortened and she never did something to him in the center of his chest. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "About what I want. Not what I am owed or what I think should happen, but what I want. Because I think you deserve to know it, and I think you deserve to decide accordingly." She waited, with the quality she had of being entirely still when she was paying full attention. "I want the 40 acres, he said. "And I want someone to build it with who thinks in specific terms and knows how to mend things and reads the condition of living creatures and recites poetry over a pot without any self-consciousness. And I am not saying that you are required to want that, or that this conversation is a negotiation. I am saying it because I think honesty is the only thing that is actually respectful here, and I respect you more than I have respected most things." She looked at him for a long moment. The river moved behind her. "You have been thinking about this since the trail," she said. It was not a question. "Since before the trail," he said. "Since the auction house." "Since the auction house," she repeated. "Bernard, you saw me for 5 minutes in the auction house." "I heard you," he said. "That was enough." She was quiet. He had the patience to wait. "I am a practical woman," she said finally. "I have told you that. I do not make decisions based on 5 minutes of feeling or on gratitude or on the sense that I owe something. I also do not make decisions to protect myself from things that might be good because they are also frightening." "No," he said. "I don't think you do." "What I know about you," she said, "is that you are honest and that you have good instincts and that you listen and that you gave away the last thing your father left you because you could not walk past something wrong. That is a considerable amount to know." She paused. "And I know that you make me laugh and that you think carefully and that your dream about the 40 acres is a specific dream that I believe you will make real." He waited. "I am not saying yes to everything at once," she said. "I am saying that I would like to continue finding things out, if that is agreeable to you." "That is very agreeable to me," Bernard said. She nodded, the brisk, efficient nod, and then she said, "Good. Now tell me what tools you have and I will tell Mrs. Strand you can look at the building tomorrow." He laughed, and she smiled, and they walked back from the river in the autumn afternoon, and he had the feeling of a man who has been cold for a long time and has just come into warmth. The months that followed were not a courtship in the formal sense. They were something more practical and more honest than that. Bernard hired on with Mrs. Strand's expansion project, working the building next door into something habitable through the winter, and Wilhelmina managed the accounts and the negotiations with the competence that Mrs. Strand had immediately recognized and relied on. They were in the same orbit 6 days a week, and they saw each other properly on Sundays, and what grew between them was composed of working alongside each other's purposes and talking every chance they got, and the growing weight of mutual trust, which is perhaps the most durable thing two people can build between them. He brought her small things, not expensive things, because he did not have expensive things, but the right things. A particular book of mathematics he found in a second-hand shop, which she received with the open pleasure of someone who is not embarrassed by what they love. Dried flowers once that he had found along the trail during a day ride east of Wichita, pressed between 2 pieces of paper, a gesture that was so unlike his general directness that she held them for a moment looking at him as though recalculating something. She brought him things too. The leather work she had been doing by firelight the night before he rode to Wichita. She presented it to him one Sunday in November, wrapped in a piece of cloth. He opened it and found a saddle seat panel, tooled with the intricate pattern of leaves and vines he had watched her work on, cut and stitched to fit Caesar's saddle to replace the cracked and mended original. It was not a broken saddle anymore. He looked at it for a long time, and then he looked at her and he could not entirely speak, and she seemed to understand that and did not require words from him for a moment. "It took a while to get the leather right," she said, with great practicality. "The color matching was the most difficult part." "It's beautiful," he said. "It is useful," she corrected. "The beauty is incidental." He looked at her. "I don't think it is," he said. "I don't think in your case beauty is ever incidental." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something had been moving toward this point for weeks, and they both felt it, and she said, with characteristic directness, "Are you going to keep saying things like that from a respectful distance, or are you going to do something about them?" He put down the saddle panel and he crossed the small distance between them. They were in the parlor of Mrs. Strand's boarding house, which was the most bourgeois possible setting for something like this, and it did not matter at all, and he took her face in his rough, careful hands, and she let him, and he kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of 2 people who had been thinking about this for a long time and were done thinking. It was warm and real and thorough, and when it was over she put her forehead against his shoulder for just a moment, one unguarded moment, and he held her carefully, as though she were something he had been trusted with. Then she straightened up and said, "There. Now we have settled that, And he laughed, the full surprised laugh she had been producing in him since the beginning, and she almost smiled and then actually smiled, and Mrs. Strand appeared in the doorway with tea and pretended she had seen nothing. December came and went, and January arrived with the hard cold of a Kansas winter. Bernard finished the building work and hired on at a livery stable through the winter months, and then got additional work helping a surveyor who was mapping land in the county, which was useful because it meant he spent time near land offices and near maps, and he made a formal inquiry about the parcel he had pointed to in the fall. The price was what the land agent had said. Bernard had saved carefully. He was close but not yet there. He went to Mrs. Strand's on a Sunday in February and told Wilhelmina where the number stood. She listened, and then she opened her own account book. She had been keeping one since arriving in Wichita, small and neat. Every transaction entered and showed him a number. He looked at it. He looked at her. "You have been saving," he said. "I have been earning," she corrected. "What I earn is mine to use as I see fit. It is my choice how to use it." "Wilhelmina, I have thought about this carefully," she said. "Do not argue with careful thought. You know better than that by now." He looked at the combined numbers. Added together, they were past the gap. They were at the number. "That is enough for the land," he said quietly. "Yes," she said, "it is enough for the land. And we would need a house on it, and that takes more time, and a start of livestock, and that takes more time, and I have thoughts about the financing of that as well. But the land first." He looked at her. The February light came through the parlor window and found the copper in her hair and the calm certainty in her face, and the account book in her hands with its small, precise entries. "I am going to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the money or the land or the practical arrangement of it, but because I love you, and I have loved you since I heard your voice in that room in Caldwell, and I have been figuring out every mile since then whether I was the kind of man who deserved to say so, and I think I might be, or I am at least trying hard enough to deserve the trying." She set the account book down very carefully on the table. "Bernard Norris," she said. "You have been figuring out since Caldwell whether you deserved me." "Yes." "Did it occur to you that I was doing the same arithmetic?" He blinked. "I suppose I have been figuring out whether you were a man worth trusting. Whether the thing you did in the auction house was instinct or habit, and whether either of those was enough, and whether you were the kind of person who kept being that way when there was no dramatic moment to rise to. And what I found," she said, "in the months since is that you are the same kind of person in the ordinary days as you are in the difficult ones, and that is rarer than most people know." She looked at him with those sage-green eyes, and there was nothing held back in them. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." They were married in the spring of 1879 in the smaller of Wichita's two churches, on a morning when the weather had turned warm, and the sky was the kind of blue that seems to be saying something optimistic. Mrs. Helena Strand was there, in her best hat. Pedro Salinas came, which surprised Bernard until he realized that Wilhelmina had written to him, because she thought about such things. Tommy Briggs came too, young and enthusiastic, and responsible for the rice that got thrown somewhat inaccurately. Jasper Cole, the farmer whose barn they had sheltered in on the trail, received a letter from Wilhelmina with the news and wrote back warmly, saying the milk cow had recovered fully from the cough and that he was glad they had found each other. The wedding itself was straightforward and honest, which was exactly what they both wanted. The Reverend asked the appropriate questions, and they answered them directly, and without the elaborate ceremony that some people preferred. What Bernard thought about, standing at the front of that church with Wilhelmina beside him, was not the grandness of the occasion but the particular texture of her attention, the way she was fully present, looking at him with the unguarded directness that she gave to all important things, which had come to feel to him like the most reliable constant in his world. He said, "I do." She said, "I do." They went outside into the spring morning, and Wichita went about its business around them, and they were married. That summer they purchased the land. The parcel south and east of Wichita, 42 acres near the creek, with good grass and a stand of cottonwood trees at the water's edge that reminded them both, privately, of the first night on the trail. Bernard filed the papers in the land office while Wilhelmina stood beside him and watched Cartwright the land agent record the deed in both their names, which required some persuasion, as this was not the standard practice. "She is part owner," Bernard said, with a calm finality that did not invite further discussion. Cartwright looked at Wilhelmina and at Bernard and wrote both names in his ledger. They broke ground on the house that summer. Bernard did most of the framing himself, with hired help for the heavy work, and Wilhelmina made the decisions about the interior with the same considered practicality she brought to everything. They worked alongside each other in the evenings after the day's work was done, and the house took shape slowly over months, board by board, and it was theirs in a way that few things had been theirs before. The first cattle came in the fall, 12 head, a modest beginning, purchased from Pedro Salinas at a price that was fair. Caesar was retired from the heavy trail work and became a horse who grazed on his own land, which he seemed to regard as appropriate. Dolly was purchased from the liveryman in Wichita, because Wilhelmina said she was attached to the mare's sensible temperament, and the liveryman, who had never been paid the original rental, accepted this as settlement of the debt. The winter of 1879 was hard, but the house was solid and the stove was good, and they were two people who knew how to work in difficult conditions, and they came through it with the herd intact and the house intact and each other intact, which was everything. In the spring of 1880, their son was born. They named him Thomas, after no one in particular, a name they both liked for its plainness and honesty. He arrived in April with the emphatic immediacy that newborns have, and was a healthy and loud boy who immediately complicated everything and improved everything in equal measure. Bernard held Thomas in the first hour after his birth and looked at him with the same quality of careful attention he gave to important things, and felt something he had no precedent for, a fullness, as though all the specific dreams had come sharply into focus simultaneously. Wilhelmina, who had worked very hard that day, watched her husband hold their son, and she thought about a woman standing on an auction platform in Caldwell, Kansas, saying, "I am not livestock to a room full of men," and she thought about the particular quality of silence that had followed those words, and then the voice from the doorway that had said 65, and she thought about the mathematics of how things find their way to where they are supposed to be. "He has your eyes," Bernard said. "He has your chin," she said. "That stubborn business that happens when you have made up your mind. I'm not stubborn, I'm decisive." "The distinction is available," she said, "but I am not sure it does the work you want it to." He laughed, and the sound of it filled the small room, and Thomas, who had been sleeping, made a noise of mild complaint, and they both looked at their son with the complete attention of two people who are, in this moment, entirely where they intend to be. The following years were full years. The herd grew slowly and well. Wilhelmina kept the accounts with her characteristic precision, and the numbers showed a farm that was moving in the right direction, not spectacularly but steadily, which was better. Bernard learned what she had told him she knew, that you could read the condition of cattle the way she read wheat, the same patience, the same attention. They taught each other things constantly, in the plain, practical way of two people who believe knowledge is not a competition. A second child came in 1882, a daughter, dark-haired and fierce-tempered and determined, who they named Clara, after Wilhelmina's mother. Clara arrived into the world with an opinion about everything, which Thomas regarded with philosophical acceptance, and which Bernard said was exactly like her mother, and which Wilhelmina said was actually exactly like her father, and the argument about this was ongoing and affectionate. They expanded the house in 1883. Bernard added a room for the children and a proper front porch that Wilhelmina had wanted since the beginning, the kind of porch where you could sit in the evening and watch the land in the fading light. They sat on it that fall of 1883, in the first evening after it was finished, and the Kansas sky did what it does in autumn evenings, which is to produce colors that seem slightly improbable: amber and deep rose, and a strip of gold along the horizon. And the cattle were moving in the near pasture, and Thomas was running along the fence line in the way of a 3-year-old who has discovered that running is available, and Clara was asleep inside. "This is the 40 acres, Bernard said. 42, Wilhelmina said. He looked at her. She was looking at the horizon with the expression she got when she was thinking about specific things, and the evening light was in her hair, which was still the same dark auburn, a few silver threads in it now that were not there before and that he found, for no reason he could entirely account for, beautiful. "It is exactly what you said it would be," she said. "I said I wanted it near water and with cattle. I didn't say much else. You said you wanted to stay in one place long enough for the earth to know your footsteps." She turned and looked at him. "How does the earth know your footsteps?" He thought about this seriously because she asked serious questions and they deserved serious answers. "The same way anything knows anything," he said. "Repeated attention. Being here over and over in all kinds of weather." She nodded. "That is what I thought you meant," she said. Thomas came careening back along the fence line and arrived at the porch steps with the dramatic breathlessness of a small person who has been running for a reason he has forgotten. And Bernard reached down and picked him up in one easy motion, and the boy grabbed his father's ear and said something urgent and not entirely intelligible about the fence and a frog. "Show me tomorrow," Bernard said. "When there is light." "Is the frog important?" Thomas demanded. "Everything near the water is important," Wilhelmina said from her chair with perfect seriousness. "We will look at it in the morning." Thomas accepted this with the reasonable satisfaction of a child whose parents take frogs seriously, and relaxed against his father's shoulder, and the three of them sat on the new porch in the evening light, and the Kansas sky continued to be improbable, and the cattle moved in the pasture and the creek ran in its cottonwood stand at the south edge of the property. Floyd Atwood, Wilhelmina's uncle, had not been heard from since Caldwell. This was not an absence she mourned. She had written him one letter, in the first months in Wichita, informing him that she was well and that she bore him no particular malice, but that she considered the connection between them to have been discharged by the events in the auction house, and that she wished him whatever luck he could manage to arrange for himself. She had not received a reply, which was also what she expected. Roy Cutter, Wilhelmina had learned through the general intelligence of the cattle circuit, had run into difficulties of the financial kind, several bad investments, and a lawsuit from a cattle buyer he had cheated, and had sold his Caldwell holdings and moved on. This information arrived in a letter from an acquaintance of Pedro Salinas and was read at the breakfast table and then folded and put aside without comment. "Are you glad?" Bernard asked. Wilhelmina poured more coffee. "I am indifferent," she said. "He is not a large part of my thinking." Bernard believed her. That was the kind of person she was. She did not spend energy on things she could not change, and she did not cultivate grievances that had already resolved themselves. She looked forward and at what was directly in front of her, and what was directly in front of her now was a good life that she had helped build, and a man she trusted, and 2 children who required feeding. Pedro Salinas came to visit in the fall of 1884, riding up the long track to the house on a Monday morning with the excuse of cattle business in the area, and he sat at their table and ate Wilhelmina's cooking and looked around at the house, and the land and the children and the general evidence of a life well constructed, and he said to Bernard, "You did well," in the tone of a man who has watched a thing happen from the beginning and takes some proprietary interest in the outcome. "We did well," Bernard said, and looked at Wilhelmina, who was at the stove and did not look up but whose shoulders lifted slightly in the way they did when she was pleased. Pedro stayed 2 days and left with a standing invitation to return, which he did, periodically, for many years. The winter of 1884 was the severest they had faced on the land, a blizzard in January that lasted 3 days and brought losses to the herd that they could not entirely prevent. They lost 4 cattle, which was not catastrophic but was real, and the weeks afterward required the kind of steady, patient rebuilding that tests a life more than a crisis does. They did it together. That was the thing that mattered. They did not assign the difficulty to one of them and let the other watch. They worked side by side in the cold and the snow and afterward in the long thaw, and they did not blame each other for what they could not control, and they did not pretend things were fine when they were difficult, and they did not stop talking. That spring, they found they had a 3rd child on the way. The news arrived in March, and they sat with it quietly for a moment, and then Wilhelmina said, "We will need to rebuild the south pasture fence before summer." And Bernard said, "Yes." And they talked about the fence and the child both, with equal practical care, because that was how they handled things. The 3rd child was another boy, arrived in the autumn of 1885. They named him Henry, after Bernard's father, which was Wilhelmina's suggestion, and Bernard did not argue, though he went outside afterward and stood in the yard for a while, and looked at the horizon in the way he did when he was thinking about something that required space. When he came back inside, she looked at him and he nodded once, and she understood the whole of it. Henry proved to be the most peaceful of the 3 children. Thomas was bold and Clara was fierce, and Henry was the one who sat and thought before acting, which Wilhelmina said he got from his father, and Bernard said he got from his mother, and which was probably both. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat together, sometimes on the porch, watching the land darken under the stars. Sometimes at the kitchen table, she with her accounts and he with whatever practical problem was current. They talked about the farm, and they talked about the children, and they talked about the kinds of things that interested them. She had started borrowing books from a woman in the nearest town who had a large library, and she read and then told Bernard about what she had read, and he listened and had opinions, and the conversations went in directions neither of them had predicted, which was the best kind of conversation. "You could teach," he said to her once, watching her explain something from a book about agricultural science with a precision and enthusiasm that made the subject genuinely interesting. "I am teaching," she said, gesturing broadly at the household. "I mean formally. There is a school opening in town. They need a teacher." She considered this with her usual thoroughness. "The farm needs management," she said. "You could do both," he said. "If you wanted to." She looked at him. "You would manage here while I was in town. I managed cattle drives for 10 years. I think I can manage 42 acres and 3 children for an afternoon." She taught school from 1887 onward, 2 afternoons a week, riding Dolly, who was old and slow and absolutely reliable, into the nearest town and back. She taught mathematics and reading and a little science, and she was, by all accounts including the accounts of the children themselves, an excellent teacher. She brought the same quality to it that she brought to everything: complete attention, genuine interest, and the absolute conviction that her students were capable of understanding whatever she put in front of them. Bernard managed. He was, in fact, very good at managing everything, not because it was easy but because he had the patience for it, and because he understood that the farm and the children and the afternoons his wife spent teaching were all part of the same thing. They were part of the specific life they had built together, board by board and season by season, starting from a broken saddle and $11.40. The broken saddle itself, or rather its replacement, rode on Caesar until Caesar's old heart gave out in the winter of 1888. Bernard buried the horse under the cottonwoods at the creek's edge, in a spot that had good shade and water nearby, because Caesar had spent his life finding good spots and deserved to rest in one. The saddle was hung in the barn on a peg, and the new horse, a younger gray gelding they named Major, eventually wore it, and the leather work Wilhelmina had tooled into it weathered gracefully over the years into something that looked as though it had always been there. Thomas, at 8 years old, asked about the saddle once, about why it was kept and not sold, since it was old and they had better things. Bernard told him the short version. A woman in an auction house had mended it, and that was how his father had known she was the right kind of person. Thomas considered this with the deliberate thought of a child who takes things seriously. "How did you know from fixing a saddle?" he asked. "You fix the things that need fixing," Bernard said. "That's what you do. Your mother understood that before most people." Thomas seemed to accept this as sufficient and went off to find his brother. And Bernard stood in the barn with the old saddle and thought about a fire and firelight and the all working steadily in the night, and the way some things announce themselves quietly and without ceremony, and are the most important things in the world. The years moved in the way that good years do, each one full and different and continuous with the ones before it. The children grew. Thomas was tall and worked hard and had Bernard's quietness and Wilhelmina's intelligence. And at 16, he was already the best rider on the property and made decisions about the herd with a soundness that Bernard deferred to without ceremony. Clara, at 13, was already formidable and showed every sign of becoming more so. She was going to be the kind of woman who did not accept the available options if they were insufficient and simply made better ones. And Wilhelmina watched her with the particular pride of someone who recognizes a quality in another that they understand from the inside. Henry, at 6, was thoughtful and gentle, and had decided he was interested in plants, which Wilhelmina thought was excellent and Bernard thought was going to be very useful on a farm. The summer of 1891 was a good one. The herd had grown to 63 head, which was where Bernard had always said he wanted it, a herd you could know individually. The wheat field they had planted the previous fall had come in well. Wilhelmina's teaching position had expanded to 3 afternoons a week, and she was managing the accounts of 2 neighboring farms as well, because word of her capabilities with numbers had gotten around, and she had found that she enjoyed the work, and it contributed to the household in real ways. On an evening in August of that summer, they sat on the porch as they often did, and the land was doing its specific summer thing. The grass gold and heavy, the cattle in the near pasture, the cottonwoods at the creek edge dark against the evening sky, the children's voices from somewhere behind the barn getting gradually quieter as the long light faded. The smell of the air was grass and water and something from Wilhelmina's garden. She had grown lavender among the vegetables for no practical reason because she liked it. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. 12 years, he said. She looked at him. They had been married 12 years that spring. "And," she said, "and it is more than I thought to have," he said simply. "I thought about the 40 acres for a long time before they were real. Now they are real and there is more than 40 acres. There is 42 acres and a house and 3 children and you, and that is—" He stopped. "Too much to enumerate," she said. "Something like that." She was quiet for a moment. The evening was doing its amber and rose business on the horizon. She looked at it the way she looked at things she was paying full attention to. "Do you know what I thought about?" she said. "In that auction house in Caldwell. Tell me. I thought, I will not give them the satisfaction of my fear. And then I heard you say $65 and I thought, who is this fool?" She paused. "And then I looked at you and I thought, this is not a fool. This is someone who cannot walk past something wrong. And I thought those 2 things were possibly the same thing." He looked at her. "They probably are." "Probably," she agreed. And the not quite a smile happened, which was still, after 12 years, one of his favorite things. "Wilhelmina," he said. "Bernard," she said, in the way she had of saying his whole name. "I love you." She turned and looked at him with those sage-green eyes in the evening light, and in them was everything that had accumulated over 12 years of knowing and building and choosing each other in the daily, ordinary, persistent way, the way that was not dramatic but was the most real way there was. "I know," she said. "I love you too. I have since before the river crossing." She paused. "The Arkansas River. When you came into camp with mud on your boots and you looked at me across the fire and you had the expression of someone who had been frightened and was not going to say so." "I was not frightened," he said. "You were. The crossing was difficult." "I was concerned. That is different." She was smiling now, the full, real smile that had never lost anything, that still arrived with the quality of something genuine and surprising. "The distinction," she said, "is available." He laughed. It rose into the evening air over the 42 acres and the 63 cattle, and the lavender in the garden, and the children's fading voices, and the cottonwoods at the creek where Caesar was buried. And Wilhelmina sat in her chair on the porch they had built together, and listened to the sound of her husband laughing, which was still one of the things she was most grateful for in a life that had given her a great many things to be grateful for. The evening settled around them. Henry appeared at the porch steps with a handful of something, rocks, or seeds, or some other small treasure of a 7-year-old's attention, and climbed into his mother's lap and showed her what he had, and she looked at it with complete seriousness and asked the right questions, and he answered them with great authority, and Bernard watched them and thought about what it meant to stay in one place long enough for the earth to know your footsteps. He thought the earth knew his. He thought this was what that meant, not only the land, though the land was real and mattered, but this. The porch, the evening, the woman who had said, "I am not livestock," in a room full of men who needed to hear it, the children who had been made from the life they'd built, the lavender smell, the creek sound, the ordinary dailiness of a love that had been chosen over and over, in mud and blizzard and difficult months and good summers, in morning coffee and account books and leather tools working steadily in firelight. He had figured out, on the ride from Caldwell, whether he was the kind of man who deserved her. He had not fully resolved it on that ride, or in the months after. The answer had come slowly, the way most true things came, through the accumulation of daily evidence. Through being the same kind of man every day that he was when it mattered. Through learning that deserving was not a destination you arrived at, but a direction you traveled in, consistently, with all the patience and attention you had. He looked at his wife on their porch in the evening light of their land, and he thought, yes, this is exactly the specific thing I was reaching for. This is exactly it. The night came in soft and full, the stars appearing one by one over the Kansas plains in the way they always had and always would, indifferent to the particular human stories below them, and the porch light glowed warm in the dark. And inside the house, Thomas and Clara were arguing about something with the passionate conviction of children who have decided this is important. And Henry had fallen asleep in his mother's lap with the completeness of the utterly trusting. And Wilhelmina had one hand on the sleeping boy and one hand resting open on the arm of her chair, and Bernard reached over and took it, and she let him, and they sat in the dark and the stars and the sound of the creek and the smell of lavender, and everything was exactly as it should be, and the land knew both their footsteps, and they were home.